Cryptocurrent, Bitcoin and Philosophy. By Nick Land. Published October 31, 2018. Dedication. 10 years to the day, since Satoshi Nakamoto released the Bitcoin white paper, is long enough. Serialization of cryptocurrent, Bitcoin and philosophy starts here, and will continue, with some moments of disorder, until the damn thing is all out. Further notes on the order of release will be forthcoming. Chunks will be limited until they're drowning in footnotes, which means not getting beyond the epigraphs today. A cryptic Halloween to all. There is a sort of vast cycle of flows of production and chains of inscription, and a lesser cycle, between the stocks of filiation that connect or incast the flows, and the blocks of alliance that cause the chains to flow. Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari. Capitalism and Schizophrenia Volume 1, Anti-Oedipus. Everybody needs money. That's why they call it money. David Mamet. Heist, 2001. What is truth? Pontius Pilate, John 18:38. I have a lot of friends who are programmers. The programmers have always gone like, those Bitcoin guys are crazy, and then, almost 100% of the time, they sit down, read the paper, read the code. It takes them a couple weeks, and they come out the other side. And they're like, oh my God, this is it? This is the big breakthrough. This is the thing we've been waiting for. He solved all the problems. Whoever he is should get the Nobel Prize. He's a genius. This is the thing. This is the distributed trust network that the internet always needed, and never had. Mark Andreessen. It would be very surprising if the Bitcoin solution to the Byzantine general's problem didn't have substantial application, that something very significant has happened. I think the prospects for that are quite good. Larry Summers. Bitcoin is hard to grasp, because it's almost like a technology from an alien civilization. Ian Bogost. In this paper, we propose a solution to the double spending problem, using a peer-to-peer distributed time-stamped server to generate computational proof of the chronological order of transactions. Satoshi Nakamoto. Nullius in verba. Motto of the Royal Society. 0, forward. Section 0.00, Cryptocurrent exists if secrecy has a trend. Such a suggestion is naturally obscure. It coaxes attention toward the surreptitious direction of things. Crypto is simultaneously the topic, and the retraction of the topic. This evasiveness is compounded by the complexity of its complement. The current eludes docile conformity with the order of objects. This is, apparently, quite independent of any strategic commitment to concealment. It is a flow of time, electricity, and cash. A turbulent conceptual confluence. Current events are the only kind. If we are unable to step into the same current twice, it is because of what irreversibility has secured in the past. A double blockage then, produced, in a stream, as concealment and as sedimentation. Subsequently, everything we have to say here is already over, but unseen. Section 0.01, is it really necessary to be so cryptic? This question will do, as a trigger. It seems, however querulously, to ask everything our title seeks to, and more than a book is able to comprehensively engage. The implicit reciprocal. Is it not possible to be clear? What begins with a minor eruption of cognitive irritation, agitated by a few specific words, opens into a history of secrecy invested with hazily discernible momentum, and beyond, into the dark Heracleite gnosis, matrix and crypt of Occidental philosophy, nature loves to hide. The provocation of integral obscurity leads to the 10,000 things. Section 0.011, glimpsed at its distant pole of unbounded abstraction, the cryptic is the ultimate philosophical enticement. At this point of origination, 2.5 millennia behind us, philosophy was nothing other than abstract cryptography. Its concern was hiding. If cryptography is currently subsuming philosophy back into itself, the historical figure thus sketched is a great cycle, an obscure return, restoration, closing an epoch of financial discretion. Most superficially, is also an irreversible liquidation into currency. Registered within the terms of the transcendental or critical philosophy, it is a departure from the pseudo-object of the present in the direction of current time. Section 0.0111, Streams run downwards. Engagement with Bitcoin brings us into communication with hidden inclinations, whose indicators mark productions of directionality, gradients, or temporalizations. Between real succession and such abstract inclines there is no difference. Entropy describes such an arrow most basically, but upon this are built a succession of stream tapping technologies, hydraulic, thermodynamic, informatic, reinforced by directional mechanisms, beginning with clockwork ratchets, and then proceeding, from the early industrial era, through check valves, into electronic forward bias diodes, rectifiers, and software implementations of one-way or trapdoor functions that support asymmetric crypto processes, and irrevocable contractual commitments. Current emerges from the machinery of time, which is to say from operational asymmetries. Flows are easily, and often lazily, invoked, without even notional attention to their engineering details. Far too much is already understood about the mechanics of irreversibility to leave such vague suggestions as a stopping point. Section 0.02, Economies are assembled from flows. Unsurprisingly, therefore, their native codes are currencies, or current signs. As societies mobilize matter-energy resource streams, their monetary conventions register these flows by inversion, and strict reciprocity. Whole flow in electronics is a close analog. Every non-barter commodity exchange, or non-financial transaction, catalyzes a flow, by pricing it. The real economy is thus automatically captured, by a monetary code, even when, as is overwhelmingly typical, this quantification through signs is never aggregated. Since money systems install an intrinsic economic intelligence, preceding all reflective theorization, economics, uniquely among the sciences, inherits a field of objectivity whose arithmetization has already taken place. This same delicate shadow, cast into business ledgers, pre-denominated by currencies, at once facilitates and registers a system of flows, in a twin production of economic objects. Business is recorded in the way it is produced. Dynamization of the commodity, or economic circulation, is not reducible to, but nevertheless strictly corresponds to, transference of signs. Section 0.021, the economic event, then, is co-original with its semiotic double. It is enabled by signs, before being represented by them. Even the secondary processing, through aggregation, of such information has a pre-theoretical foundation. Powerful economic agencies, most significantly the state's tax authorities, concentrate commercial data, long before scientific political economy begins to recompile it, as an analytical object. Logos arrives late. Section 0.03, it approaches a truism, although not one for this reason to be glibly dismissed, that philosophy assumes, as if by right, a position of sovereign authority relative to everything it touches upon. A discussion of Bitcoin and philosophy amounting only to a confirmation of this stance would merit contempt, even if it were packaged as humor. Since any attempt to philosophize about Bitcoin would already be a joke, it is better to get it. Bitcoin seizes philosophical attention because it is already doing philosophy, or what philosophy is still, on ever-rare occasions, expected to do, and at multiple levels. It tells the truth. Bitcoin is not only a recognizable philosophical statement, but also, and more importantly, a philosophical automatism, a synthetic philosophical machine. It not only philosophizes in the manner of a man, although this is its certain prospect, but also finally in the way of an angel, or a lesser god. The intellectual intuition, intellectual Anschauung, that is for Kant a mortal impossibility, is for Bitcoin an operational principle. It is destined to close upon itself, and thus know itself. By becoming time, Bitcoin promises an exhibition of unleashed thought, in a way no introspective anthropology ever can. Section 0.031. Throughout this book, philosophy is employed freely as an abbreviation for modern philosophy, which is in turn consistently conceived, tacitly when not overtly, as critique in its, roughly, Kantian sense. To philosophize on any subject over recent centuries, as still today, has been to criticize, in the positive acceptation of this term, by differentiating the transcendental format from the empirical datum, and then resolving, or, stated more realistically, negotiating, the boundary conflicts between the two. However it is specifically articulated, critique isolates a properly transcendental productive principle, or function, which is constitutive of a domain, rather than existing as an item within one. It thereby marks a unilateral or ontological difference, which is to say, a discrepancy irreducible to any relation between terms that are internal to the domain considered. Critique is, necessarily, the theoretical assertion of a non-empirical partition. Through critical abstraction, the consistent order of the system considered is liberated from its specific instantiation, to become a philosophical preoccupation, immunized against the distractions of any merely factual controversy about its content, but also, simultaneously, or diagonally, from purely formal considerations of its internal logical organization. It is committed to a zone of positive discovery, which logic cannot be, that is systematically enveloping, as no empirical concern can be. Philosophy, as such, no longer has anything else whatsoever to attend to. If philosophy cannot be critique, it cannot be anything that matters within modernity. That is its essential immanent law. Section 0.032. The target of critique is metaphysics, conceived as a specifiable cognitive error. As determined by Kant, at the origin of the transcendental critical enterprise, metaphysics is understood as the systematic attempt to apprehend transcendental or ultimate conditions of objectivity, as if they were themselves objects. The repudiation of this effort can be summarized with approximate adequacy in a phrase that serves as a critical war cry: objectivity is not itself an object. This is to borrow freely from the critical framing of metaphysical error as it is found, compactly formulated, in the Heideggerian fundamental ontological restatement of transcendental philosophy. Being is not a being. More significantly, for our current purposes, it can be conveniently extended to apply to contemporary techno-social arrangements and communications apparatuses, by way of a comparatively simple translation protocol. Metaphysics, over against which disciplined philosophical critique emerges antagonistically, is instantiated by any identification of a systemic function, with some node internal to the system considered. It can therefore be readily seen that the flattening of a network, through the elimination of system-critical, concentrated, indispensable nodes, which is to say through the distribution of its efficient principle, is an exact, if abstract, execution of a critical operation in the Kantian sense. A network is a critique. Section 0.04. Already, at the most naive level of its acceptation, Bitcoin is a word that refers to at least three things. Of these, the most elementary, although today least invoked as a definition of the term, is a succinct, technical paper, in whose catalytic code everything was, in a certain sense, already implicit. There is nothing obvious about this terminological development. To speak of the critique of pure reason is first of all to name a book, even though, no less than with Bitcoin, it is the book's object that is being named. Critique of pure reason, the thing, is in this case a delayed signification, despite the fact the title says nothing else. In the case of Bitcoin, This system of acceptations is conspicuously inverted. Bitcoin is not understood primarily as a paper, perhaps because it is not primarily an argument. Its nexus of persuasion has migrated outward, in close association with the meaning of code. Critique undergoes accelerating automation. Section 0.041, the philosophically pressing motive for hesitation, however momentary, at this point of origin, where the balance between the virtual and the actual is most dramatically precarious, is to hold open the question of primordial introduction, even as it tends to eclipse itself. Already, during this remarkably brief embryonic phase, when Bitcoin was implemented only in words, it was at least double, at once a title and a topic. From the beginning, the term pointed beyond the name of a text, towards a virtual entity, something that could be made to happen, or that was, in being rigorously outlined, already being made to happen. In being drafted, it was in fact initiated, even released, and through its preliminary scripting it had already been informally pre-programmed, or practically introduced. Bitcoin has existed from the moment it was named, and its origin could be pushed still further back. Such a cult potentiation of the semiotic event is what it is to code, in the modern sense of this term. It is something much more than description. As code, writing is transported beyond representation to an operational horizon, where it builds what it says, immediately. Language that cannot follow it along this path is already a husk, inconsequential by essence, unless politics can save it. Bitcoin is the bet that it cannot. Section 0.042, even when not explicitly referencing a text, and thus evoking the gap between word and thing, the name Bitcoin remains divided by a fatal difference, one of still greater importance to our discussion. The initial, narrow, version of this rift, distinguishing any quantity of bitcoins from the comprehensive singularity of Bitcoin, is a critical fault line to which we will repeatedly return. It anticipates, while remaining irreducible to, a schism, of gathering social concreteness and historical consequence, opened by the polarization of Bitcoin, conceived as specific, contingent, branded, and politically or competitively extinguishable, over against the blockchain, a generic technological innovation, that is accepted as irreversible, and promoted as conservatively assimilable. Threading through the most energized Bitcoin debates is a question of limitation. Can the currency system be circumscribed, and then transcended, as the larval stage of something greater than itself, serving as the historical bootloader for a new internet revolution driven by generic blockchain-based trustless transactions protocols? The philosophical rift reactivating transcendental empirical difference, in the domain of monetary technology has, thus, already been dramatically opened, and even tentatively evaluated, in the course of a process of widely reported, financially invested, socio-economic exploration, before any self-conscious philosophical activity reaches it. During the elaboration of this controversy, some of the crucial interests at stake in Bitcoin's inner rift have been exposed, and their theoretical absorption facilitated. The fact that the question has been raised by opportunistic venture capital does nothing at all to detract from its perfectly philosophical character, as captured, with reasonable fidelity, by the formulation, "What are the limits of Bitcoin?" Section 0.043, it is at the third, and fully historical, level of meaning, however, that the ultimate scope of Bitcoin's significance is gradually manifested. Beyond the initial formulation, or abstract protocol, and its subsequent implementation as a functioning currency system, and already something more, there emerges a far broader Bitcoin installation process, of evidently vast but still obscure character and magnitude. The formula is a diagram. The implementation is an active database supporting a cryptocurrency. But what undergoes installation is an entire techonomic ecology or infrastructure, a complex manifold of interlocking parts, whose horizons are still lost to us in hazy distances, however rapidly we are hurtling into them. It is on this dimension that Bitcoin and philosophy is most clearly and comprehensively overwhelmed. After being thought, and then done, Bitcoin promises, or threatens, to change the way everything is thought and done, or would be thought to do so, were it not that in the age of code such dulled terms have outlived their usefulness, and persist only through inertia. Section 0.05. Bitcoin Machines Value. It follows that the prevailing conception of technology as instrumental capability, subsumed under extrinsic ends, is among the very many things to fall by the wayside as the process escalates. Traditional categories of thought, or conception, and action, or performance, are mutually subsumed into an irreducible cognitive action. The strengthening diagonal current passing between the notional and the actual, ought and is, intelligence and mechanism, which in its aporetic articulation has been the exquisite torture of postmodern philosophy, is simply code. Bitcoin ushers this cryptic fatality into simultaneous conceptual and mechanical consummation. Section 0.051. It is necessary to go further. In the final analysis, nothing less than the nature of reality is brought into question by this event. It concerns the being of beings, at least. If the claim seems extravagant, it is nevertheless inescapable, once the transcendental status of an ultimate criterion based upon absolute succession is granted to the Bitcoin protocol. It is not only that no higher tribunal exists. When envisaged at a sufficient level of abstraction, no higher tribunal could possibly exist. The Bitcoin ledger is the first intrinsically reliable record. It is now known what happened, without argument. This is a situation without precedent which also reaches, immediately, an absolute limit, in principle. It thus exemplifies the synthetic a priori. There is no philosophical thinking of Bitcoin, in either the subjective or objective genitive, that is not also, simultaneously, a rethinking of time, or sovereign decision. Rethinking is a revision, but no less a restoration. Bitcoin introduces us to a time machine, or time synthesizer, which can only complicate any initial intuitions about its novelty. It has been on the way for centuries, at least. This will, in any case, constitute the stubborn, guiding assertion of the book. Section 0.06. Cryptocurrency is organized into 6 sections, which together compose a cycle. The analytically dismantled circuit of Bitcoin, with each segment seized as a philosophical provocation, finally closes upon itself in an attestation of its positive groundlessness. The loop of Bitcoin auto-production knows nothing of transcendence, at any stage. Whatever might have sought to intrude, representing an extrinsic authority, is dismissed as a superfluous trusted third party. The circuit is the entire thing. Section 0.061. On the path to a philosophical hash of Bitcoin as a transcendental horizon, cryptocurrency commits itself to a number of interlocking but isolable propositions. Among these, the most intensely exploited, which is to say, those found indispensable for our purposes, are advanced here, in the approximate order of their introduction. Compressed in this way, they can only appear ill-grounded, or dogmatic. They are anticipated in this way for the purposes of convenient preparation, not persuasion. Digits from the first decimal place mapped to sections of this book where the relevant discussion is found. Section 0.1. Chapter 1 provides an introduction. It takes a short Satoshi Nakamoto text as its point of departure, in order to capture Bitcoin as lava. Its intimate relation with the history of cryptography is supplemented by something hidden, working out through it. Word becomes code. Section 0.11. At the beginning, there is a yet underestimated philosophical work. Whatever happens to Bitcoin, its status as a decisively important document will be secure. Furthermore, reflexively, what is meant by a document will never again be the same, after logical envelopment by the category of the ledger entry. Documentation has crossed a new threshold of mechanization. Bitcoin the documentary is thus an expose in which nothing is hidden, unless behind a fully manifested mask. It binds publicity to security. All Bitcoin does is secure documentation, which is enough. Section 0.12. The entire cycle is captured by this preliminary diagram, as an electronic cache system. In the closure of this cycle, a rupture, or irreversible occurrence, has taken place, comparable in structure and scale to Gödelian transcendental arithmetic, and to public key encryption. Money changes phase, with an abrupt radicality from which there can be no return. Section 0.2, Chapter 2 explores the reciprocal application of transcendental philosophy and the Bitcoin protocol to each other. It is proposed that the critical triple skein of ontological difference, subtraction of transcendence, and temporalization can be pursued, without significant interruption, into the analysis of Bitcoin. It takes Satoshi Nakamoto's 2008 Bitcoin paper as its basic text, since this is what the word Bitcoin, by informally standardized cultural convention, names. Section 0.21, Bitcoin is first broached as a philosophical topic, and thus, subsequently, as a mode of philosophical access to other things. Philosophy is required to concede much, in following this track, especially in regard to the traditionally conceived cultural and institutional basis of its own authority. The order of discussion follows the course of the problem, the double spending problem, DSP, as it is nominated, which is understood critically, not only as a practical obstacle to functional cryptographic currency, but also as a philosophical topic of radical generality. Duplicity in its deepest and broadest sense is the target. The DSP cannot be resolved, then, without simultaneously bringing singularity into the fold of formal engineering. The concrete execution of the Bitcoin protocol provides a peculiarly vivid demonstration of the socio-technical, machinic, or techonomic, production of abstract singularities. Anything else would be cheating. Section 0.211, Critique. The critique of metaphysics, is philosophy, as a current undertaking. It is what philosophy has irreversibly become. Insofar as these terms still diverge, however minutely, there is a task that remains uncompleted. Philosophy establishes itself in modernity by way of auto-critique. Like capital, it is a path with firm direction, but without destination. The path is the destination. It exists only by perpetually overcoming itself. Critical, or diagonal, method is a tool through which philosophy is definitively exhausted. Its sole product is immanence. The rigorously complementary formulation asserts, residual transcendence is the negative of the philosophical undertaking. The systematization of the synthetic a priori is the model of diagonalization in philosophy. Bitcoin is therefore in the very strictest sense a critical enterprise, targeting trusted third parties as superfluous metaphysical structures. Immanence is its techonomic, or socio-historical, rather than its merely reflective conceptual output, or production. Section 0.2111, Critical method coincides exactly with diagonal argument. It identifies pseudo-tautologies and proceeds through their complementary pseudo-paradoxes. The synthetic a priori is the model. Circuits are diagonals. They do not resolve in one way or another, but always between, either in a hunt for equilibrium, or a flight through entire excitation. Section 0.22, Analytic synthetic difference registers cryptographic asymmetry within philosophy. It marks the irreversible. In keeping with the mainstream critical tradition, the formulation of methodical procedure is subsumed into the problem of time. The philosophical problem of time, it might be said, if this were not an invitation to misunderstanding. Restoration of transcendental temporality, or absolute succession, is a philosophical achievement only insofar as the process of philosophy has been thoroughly disanthropomorphized, technicized, economized, and, thus, spontaneously materialized. The realization of the idea is only accomplished in the machine. Auto-materialization is so essential to the critical process that it amounts to an intrinsic destiny. Critique cannot consolidate itself other than as historical modernity. It would be a redundancy, or merely emphatic, to add, in reality. Mechanization is nothing but mechanization in reality, and in fact compresses further, to sheer realization, or production. Section 0.221, Natural Philosophy, which achieves intellectual autonomy as physics, lies directly in the path of the question of time. In particular, it has radically reframed transcendental aesthetic within cosmological space-time, where absolute temporality finds no place. Bitcoin can only interrupt this apparent tendency to theoretical detemporalization, since there can be no resolution of the DSP without strictly determinable succession. Bitcoin, and time restoration, are finally indistinguishable. Section 0.23, Network Thinking, as instantiated by the Bitcoin protocol, complies with the preeminent contemporary operationalization of transcendental philosophy, which is considered here, with a maximum of strategic vehemence, to be exactly synonymous with critique. A reliable expectation follows, that Internet production is accompanied by format, data differentiation, interlayers, eradication of transcendence, absence of critical nodes, and temporalization, primordial production of absolute succession, or post-relativistic order. The network, radically conceived, is a quasi-teleological manifestation, tending towards the actualization of a principle that is itself emergent, and which functions as a criterion of intelligibility. In consequence, any network can be evaluated with reference to an abstract model of self-reproducing decentralization. Bitcoin exemplifies, which is to say realizes, this process with exceptional starkness. Section 0.3, Chapter 3 engages semiotics, or signs about signs. It concentrates upon the status of Bitcoin as a solution to the double spending problem, or DSP. A case is made for the extreme generality of the DSP as a practical semiotic quandary, roughly coextensive with the existence of life. Resolution of the DSP through a crypto-secure proof-of-work protocol is thus an episode in terrestrial biohistory, and not merely a drastic anthropological, or mature industrial capitalist, innovation, even if it is also both of these. What the protocol addresses is no less than virus, in its broadest extension. It corrects the intrinsic economic crisis of the sign. Semiotic values are instructions, and necessarily coinages. They make a difference, of economic consequence. Duplicity, hijacking, is thus automatically incentivized. To capture instructions is to command resources. This strategic option is no younger than the organism. Section 0.31, Potential duplicity is a foundational semiotic concept, with extension far beyond the anthropomorphic sphere. Virus already effectuates it, without any recourse to metaphor. The sensitivity of any system to code is, primordially, a vulnerability to capture. The programmable is the reprogrammable. Zoosemiotics is enveloped by this dilemma. No organism that takes advantage of clues, or cues, escapes their strategic ambiguity. Reading risks misreading essentially, and long before language. The hazard of trickery, by mimics, or deceivers, was not an invention of man, still less of digital information systems. Section 0.32, Spam, nevertheless, dramatizes the inherent tendency of the duplicitous sign with peculiar sharpness. It is no coincidence that the genesis of Bitcoin is deeply interconnected with the practical problem of spam filtration. Spam experimentally demonstrates anti-money. In this, it has been a great teacher. Any functional system of message value credentials, negatively determined against spam, is already an embryonic digital currency. Section 0.33, Robust credential production makes money, whose ultimate basis is counter-duplicity. Bitcoin variants, or altcoins, belong firmly to the same field of problems. Altcoins are, at least partially, duplications, quasi-copies, or rough clones. The superiority of Bitcoin, in respect to competitive altcoins, can rest only in its originality, or first-mover advantage, since nothing precludes the emergence of a perfect copy. the eventuation of network effects, i.e. raw or irreducible singularity, does everything. Coinage has no essence beyond its event. From an exact date, something happens. There is no doubt more that can be said, but it cannot stretch to full specification of the phenomenon, even in principle. Bitcoin is, both rigorously and redundantly, or in multiple senses, a production of singularity. Non-duplicity captures this in its most generically intelligible dimension. A DSP solution defines a semiotic, irreducible to the signifier or the index, to sense or reference, and already tacit in the nature of the monetary sign. Section 0.34. Explication of the double spending problem, or DSP, necessarily produces, or reproduces, an economic theory of the sign. It restores exclusivity, or, in the language of the economists, the rivalrous sense of the semiotic entity, as commercial token. Resolution of double spending can only be a compression to singularity, as grammatical function and implicit concept, but more basically as practical resource. The conservation of value establishes its real and intrinsic, i.e. autonomous, ground. In this way, alone, it establishes its conditions of existence, in a circuit, by resourcing itself. Section 0.35, the generality of the DSP is evident in many other dimensions. The double opens the door to proliferation without limit. In this respect, double spending invokes the double of the doubling period, rather than that of double checking, or double entry bookkeeping, both of which figure on the other side of the account. According to the defining procedure of double entry bookkeeping, whenever money is added, on one side of a ledger, it is subtracted on the other. This requirement implements a distinctive semiotic procedure, irreducible to either signification or designation, which can be named allocation. It is only with regard to its allocative function that a sign can be spent, which is also to say, function as a rivalrous good, in the economic sense. To transmit a sign, while still keeping it, in the fashion of language, is the essence of the DSP. A DSP solution, such as Bitcoin, is therefore, by necessity, an assault upon the linguistic model of the sign. Money is not a language. Insofar as it rises to prominence within semiotic theory, it necessarily dethrones the linguistic ideal. Within the anthropomorphic domain, it is precisely in becoming non-linguistic, and non-representational, that signs start to work. Signs are operators, which makes them worth stealing. They are keys, or passes. Virus grasped this more than 3 billion years ago. Section 0.4, Chapter 4 approaches Bitcoin as a contribution to, and problem for, the theory of games. Such a contextualization is ineluctable. The Byzantine general's problem, which prompts the Bitcoin solution, is a model game theoretic quandary, situated within the project of formalizing distributed coordination, which has accompanied modernity from its inception. Section 0.41. The Bitcoin protocol is designed as a game. Incentives are built into its infrastructure. It only works when it is played. The distinctive feature of the Bitcoin game is that it produces binding decisions without a referee, or dependence upon prior agreement. Coordination is neither presumed, nor invoked, but produced. The absence of all superior authority makes Bitcoin transcendental in the philosophical sense, and adapts it to anarchy in the rigorous sense this term carries in the field of international relations theory. Any player is welcome to cheat. No moves that are possible are forbidden. Do your worst is its open invitation. This is what trustlessness means. Section 0.42, Social analysis is a regional application of game theory. There is no conception of the social extricable from the domain of games. Transcendental philosophy can be hashed into a game-theoretically tractable vocabulary, which facilitates its general social application. The meaning of spontaneous order is finally indissociable from, and collaborating with, that of games. In both cases, what is posed is the strategic problem of multiplicity, or primordial non-coordination. War, politics, and formalized commerce stack successively upon it. Section 0.421, Consensus, as technically formalized within Bitcoin, is game-theoretic coordination, or the solution to a collective action problem. It thus unlocks the most basic problems of social science. Money games, especially, require hard commitments. The DSP is conceived in these game-theoretic terms as revisability. It is the negative of a hard, or irrevocable, commitment. Unambiguous irrevocability, then, sets the Bitcoin engineering problem. Lock-in is its specialism. Section 0.422, more particularly, the whole of Bitcoin politics belongs here, including both the conflicts over and within the cryptocurrency. From the side of Bitcoin, the initial and framing challenge of the game is to get itself played. This unfolds in the rough where, to mix metaphors, turning over the table remains an option, at least in appearance. Section 0.4221, there is necessarily a question, defining of the left in this domain, whether Bitcoin should be allowed at all. The ideologically basic issue is permission. At this level, the game is existential for Bitcoin, and everything it carries, meaning the occult liberal tradition. Mere survival counts as a win. If permissionless process can establish itself, a great veto is irreversibly nullified. The political sphere is downsized. Section 0.4222, if this trend were not resisted, liberalism would have no enemies. Prevention of Bitcoin, however, looks to be already a lost cause. What Bitcoin essentially is, cannot easily be distinguished from this anticipated outcome, which is to say, from its bare survival. Existential security was baked into the protocol originally. Section 0.4223, if rejection proves impractical, might there be moderation? Within Bitcoin itself, there is almost everything to play for. Crypto destiny appears to bifurcate, even before it forks. The relevant spectrum of variation separates mainstreamers from ultras. The dominant topic here is assimilation or, reciprocally, regime change. Is Bitcoin a tool, or a weapon? This question is folded into Bitcoin's block size war, which is as important as any conflict of our age. Section 0.5, Chapter 5 is concerned with the function of Bitcoin as money. Theoretical articulation of this problem requires a transcendental deduction of money, as the condition of possibility for commercial calculation. Within this deduction, the 6 traditional qualities of money, durability, scarcity, divisibility, communicability, fungibility, and verifiability, occupy the place of structurally inevitable forms, or categories. In other words, and with some qualification, they are predictable, a priori, aspects of money, rather than its mere empirical features. They are mathematically conditioned, and only occasioned by historical causality. Once grasped conceptually, they are confidently expected. Nothing could be money otherwise, with only notably bizarre exceptions. It follows, in accordance with a priori synthesis, that a robust cryptocurrency will take the form of artificial gold. Section 0.51, money has 6 categories. The 3 indispensable monetary functions, as a store of value, means of exchange, and unit of account, are presumed to be structurally indispensable to this analysis. They are diagonally complicated by stock and flow, the pseudo-synonyms of value storage and exchange, to generate an architectural principle. Section 0.511, the concept of money is not rigorously delimitable. For essential reasons, it has never been captured by a definite idea. We still do not know what money can do. Section 0.52, the story of money, which coincides closely with history as such, can be told in many different ways. There are primarily anthropological, economic, technological, and political versions, among others. Cryptocurrency tells a number of these, very briefly. Section 0.53, abstraction emerges within the historical process, as an immanent product. The monetization of human societies during the Axial Age, 2500 BC, inaugurates it, triggering the innovation of philosophical and mathematical thought. Money thus conditions the birth of philosophy before becoming a philosophical object, and mathematizes before becoming a regional application for mathematics. Section 0.531, Money thinks. In fact, it outthinks us, insofar as reflection is brought to it late, after its own cognitive operation has been long at work, and ultimately perhaps also in other ways, yet to be apprehended, from our side. It has already made sense of things, before we have begun to make sense of it. We have no grounds upon which to affirm, with confidence, that money and general intelligence can be finally distinguished. The institutional separation between artificial intelligence research and cryptocurrency innovation is not rooted in philosophical principle. The expectation that catalepsy, distributed commercial learning, or price discovery encounters a limit short of the question of the price of being, finds its sole resilient foundation in moral indignation. Since Bitcoin demonstrably does ontology, and even fundamental ontology, the status of normative revulsion in this domain is irredeemably dubious. Section 0.532, Having yet to think money, beyond a preliminary stage, we are poorly positioned to set hard boundaries around what money itself can think. Meditations upon the ultimate conceptual relation between money and social identity are inhibited, or interrupted, by an indignant retraction of self from configurations of crystallized value. Yet money already preempts this recoil, and with greater effectiveness, through its insinuation of liquidity, and consequent socio-cultural intensifications of liquidization, liquefaction, and liquidation. All that is solid melts into a liquid, wherever money touches it. Money dissolves stuff. Currency says this, realistically. To be insulted by monetary denomination of sacralized values, then, is to assume far too much. There is a definite metaphysics at work here, which is to say an image or objectification of money that cannot survive critical scrutiny, or, more importantly, critical social process. Section 0.533, Our dominant models are undergoing rapid obsolescence. For instance, money does not reduce to the concept of credit, even though this reduction has made itself, at least momentarily, inevitable. As the most recent and most complex episode in the history of money, financialization dominates its contemporary conceptualization, and this development was, until very recently, expected to further escalate in the same direction, determined increasingly by invisibility, credit facilitation, and institutional trust. Money appeared to be converging with the function of a bank account. This apparent teleology, guided to invisibility, was extraordinarily vivid. Cryptocurrency ironizes and derails it. This is why the history of money has now to be retold. Section 0.6, Chapter 6 closes the Bitcoin cycle, by attending to the absorption of socio-economic identity into cryptography, the matrix of philosophy. The Bitcoin wallet is a mask. Asymmetric cryptography formalizes irreversibility at an unprecedented level of techonomic intensity. It initiates the age of the open secret, or of masks. Bitcoin is its currency. Section 0.61, Cryptography envelops philosophy, in reality. The practical processing of secrecy defines a transcendental horizon. Epistemology is broken by its own naivety when it assumes an object without intrinsic impulse to escape. To know is to capture, grasp, or seize. It is thus, at least roughly, to fight. Bitcoin, whose lineage is cryptographic, inherits better instincts, by far, in respect to knowledge and truth than those typifying professional philosophy. It expects trouble, and not only difficulty. Its technical specifications are strategic, at the root. Rather than seeking shelter, Bitcoin makes cryptographic attack an intrinsic part of its security infrastructure. Its miners are poachers made gamekeepers. Section 0.62, The twin key cryptography which Bitcoin builds upon is a philosophical innovation of extraordinary, and still enormously underestimated, importance. recursively, it is itself a key to the secrets of the dyad. The crudity of dialectical and structural articulations is comical in comparison. The cryptographic lineage directs application of this machinery, initially, to the public-private distinction, which it practically and conceptually solves. Section 0.63 Bitcoin significantly accommodates agent identities to the rising age of masks, in which digital avatars implement the empirical ego of transcendental philosophy. Identity, address, and account, wallet, are brought into exact coincidence. All are a single fully publicized disguise. Section 0.64 The concept of property remained weakly defined, prior to the age of advanced cryptography, and the rigorous abstract determination of keys. It is upon lockings and unlockings that the entire reality of property is built. When critically collapsed onto the plane of cryptographic immanence, privacy and property are indistinguishable. Both are accounted in keys. No other valuables in reality exist. Section 0.65 Asymmetry, as operationalized within public key cryptosystems, is an implementation of time, a temporalization, or current. Things go one way rather than another. It is cryptography, then, finally, that unlocks the historical meaning of philosophy, by retrieving the keys of time. Bitcoin realizes absolute succession as accomplished artifice. The cycle is closed. Section 0.71 Three appendices are gathered in the penultimate section of the book. The first is devoted to a slightly larger reading of the Satoshi Nakamoto Bitcoin paper than that undertaken in Chapter 3. The second, folded into two subdivisions, engages diagonal method, the principal procedure of modern philosophy, and its application to the techonomic integrity of the modern industrial process. The third discusses the geopolitics of Bitcoin in reference to concrete contemporary issues of currency hegemony, the status of the US dollar, and the economic rise of China. Section 0.72 The apparatus includes a Bitcoin timeline, very short briefings on coins, organizations, and people, a glossary, and references. This information is suggestive, more than exhaustive. The scale of the cryptocurrency phenomenon already exceeds any realistic prospect of comprehensive purchase, or fine-grained general introduction. Section 0.8 Finally, but also before, there's another thing. It might even be regarded as the main thread. Historically, it will have been. We can be exorbitantly confident about that, with such anticipation being the entire point. There is something more than a progressive causal series at stake in the arrival of Bitcoin. Preliminarily, and from historical necessity, this concern proceeds under the sign of teleology. It has to be noted clearly from the beginning, however, that an unambiguous defense of teleology would be no less unbalanced than its simple negation, amounting to mere regression. Between final and efficient causation it does not suffice, either in the end, or effectively, to choose. The philosophical obligation is always diagonal. In this case, Bitcoin entrusts us with the teleomechanical line, which inherits and protracts the fundamental modernistic pseudo-paradox of mechanistic liberalization. There is no real freedom outside the innovation of machines. Yet to recover teleology is simultaneously to attack it. As with anything worth defending at all, when teleology is critiqued, it gets stronger. It needs to be gnawed more aggressively, which means, first of all, pulling it back off the shelf, or out of the fridge. Teleology is reanimated as a question when the end is intuited at work. Which is to say, in the working out of the process the pretended sovereignty of the beginning is dethroned. We cannot but ask, what is Bitcoin becoming? This question is itself a piece of fate. Section 0.81 It cannot be sufficiently stressed that teleological thinking typically goes wrong. If it had not been prematurely dismissed, its structural failures would have been better understood. Modernity has not harried it enough. The principal teleological error is hubris, which is known to philosophy, in its general theoretical manifestation, as metaphysics. In this case, it manifests as the pretense to adequate apprehension of the telos, whatever its variant, as if it were an object. This error is profound, and might easily seem to provide ample justification for the programmatic extinction of teleological thinking without remainder. Yet such a response, which has in fact predominated within modernity, is hyperbolic. It leads predictably, which is to say inevitably, or in fact by ultimate irony finalistically, to a cognitive vulgarization, and typically a geometricization, of time, in which the defining asymmetry of the temporal axis is extinguished. Transcendental temporality cannot be reduced to the correlate of a purely mechanical process, for instance, to a dimension, without obliterating its time signature entirely. Radical space-time distinction is a Kantian inheritance that critique cannot elect to abandon. Once time is freed, again, from geometry, it announces itself through certain definite quasi-teleological or historically anomalous effects. Minimally, it allows for something new. It thus lends itself to teleology in its rigorous employment, which is bound to the disingenuously innocent question, what is happening? Such interrogations conform to the eventuation, or emergence, of an entire ontological topic, delivered by the problematic, or non-objective, thing. Section 0.82, it might very reasonably be asked, why clutter an already overcrowded book with an insistent sub-theme in partial defense of teleological thought? The primary response, Bitcoin is, finally, more intelligible in terms of its destination than its genesis. The more attentively it is examined, the more inescapable the question, what is it becoming? What does Bitcoin lead to? This is not a secondary, supplementary, or ancillary puzzle. The network effects locking Bitcoin into history are exactly the same thing, seen differently. Bitcoin makes historical sense, when it can be seen that it was expected, or anticipated, if only by a virtual subject, whose actuality is itself outcome dependent. The attractor exceeds the protocol. It was a piece of destiny from the beginning. Capital teleology is the guide. Reciprocally, what capital has been about is unanswerable without attention to Bitcoin. Nothing denominated in money can be realistically apprehended without recognition that the nature of money is undergoing the single most catastrophic revolution in its history, and is thus ceasing to support expectations that rely upon the simple tracking forward of precedent. Since capital process societies have long been denounced, understandably, for attempting to put a price on everything, the scope of this revolution is not readily bounded. Section 0.83 The story of Bitcoin, however enthralling it might be, cannot provide the central preoccupation of a book devoted to the philosophical meaning of cryptocurrency. While it is a subordinate purpose of this work to recommend Bitcoin for dedicated historiographical attention, it does not pretend to execute such research in any serious way. Initially, the problem is quite straightforwardly practical. The extraordinary dynamism of Bitcoin makes it a moving target. It generates more history than can be humanly absorbed in real time. In other words, it escapes. Yet, while at one level, this comparative paucity of historical resolution follows from an economic decision about the distribution of time, it also doubtless reflects an essential philosophical prejudice, prioritizing abstraction. Despite firm conclusions regarding ultimate path dependency, cryptocurrency cannot be primarily historical, because it is drawn into the idea of Bitcoin, in something far closer to the Platonic sense of this term than its epistemological, or even merely psychological, successor. Its topic envelops temporality, and engages the production, rather than the unfolding, of time. In this respect, it adheres to the mainstream of the critical tradition, for which primordial temporalization is the key. Cryptocurrency's chronogenic process. It is that, alone, which cannot assume time. History is grounded by critique, as in an abyss. Section 0.84, it might be asked, pointedly, in rejoinder, is not time, in the end, or in the closure of the circuit, produced historically? While this question is incisive, and even irresistible. It is, notably, not itself historical, but rather dynamically meta-historical. No historian can ever confirm its force through accumulated evidence, since it would remain unsettled after even the most extravagant factual illustration. Historiography is disturbed by it no less than philosophy. When history descends into it, it is on an approach to its ultimate criterion. Such a question cannot, then, amount to a deflection from the philosophical task of thinking time as such. Tightening nonlinearity ensures that even if time itself has thresholds of emergence, marked by dates, such as October 31, 2008, the dating system provides no stable frame, but is plunged into immanence, and thus absorbed into the vortex of irreducibly cyclical dependency. There is nothing historical that can be known about time in advance. Bitcoin intensifies this problem, which is that of modern philosophy in general, towards its limit. Artificial time leaves no context unconsumed. It is transcendental, if it is time at all. No story of any kind can be adequate to it. Section 0.85, such reservations do not suggest, even remotely, that the prospects for a history of time can be simply dismissed. Precisely because time is a transcendental horizon, time cannot be found anywhere other than in time. Nonlinear history, to employ Manuel Delander's term in its most radical sense, comprehends the philosophy of time, through the exact real coincidence of its twin terms. It is only that, when historiography reaches this threshold, it has already become something else. The work of Peter Galison is a particularly remarkable case. His magnificent study of Einstein and Poincare, which grounds the time relativity problem of early 20th century mathematical physics in the techno-administrative imperative to synchronization, is an exemplary excavation of chronogenetic circuitry. The point of theoretical climax is marked by an irreducible codependency of historical process and time production, in which each finds its grounds within the other. Neither pole in this circuit submits to its alternative without cascading confusion. Section 0.86, from a certain perspective, that is not altogether reducible to dialectical illusion, the history of Bitcoin is structured by a limited number of dominating controversies, at a variety of levels. The spectrum extends from ideological disputes in the grand style of classical political economy to the detailed practicalities of investment decision-making. Three principal modes of hostile response can be isolated, and sequenced roughly as phases, corresponding to guiding attitudes of dismissal, antagonism, and condescension. Each of these objections can be expected to rise in public prominence in the years ahead, as Bitcoin attracts increasing attention. Since publicity has some strong correlation with positive network effects, even opposition can be perversely supportive. The old saw that all publicity is good publicity, is highly attuned to network dynamics. Section 0.861, Dismissal, at its most emphatic, coincides with the prediction that Bitcoin will not, and cannot, succeed. When sincerely maintained, it is no more an argument against Bitcoin, than atheism is an argument with God. The stakes are low, the occasion for fervor limited. The most facile dismissal of Bitcoin derides it as a scam, perhaps a pyramid scheme. It appears to be based on nothing beside the production of confidence in itself. Such criticism reveals more than it seeks to about money in general, and its attendant superstitions. Ironically, it revives the crudest metalist metaphysics in defense of a threatened post-metallic monetary status quo. Section 0.8611. Given the rapid emergence of cryptocurrency as an asset class, it would be peculiar if questions had not been raised about the adequacy of Bitcoin as money. Among the most vociferously noted of these has been directed toward the extreme volatility of the Bitcoin price. Further grounds for dismissal include socio-political and technical scaling problems. The inbuilt deflationary bias of the currency has also been a source of persistent concern, although this tilts quickly into more radical zones of ideological criticism. Bitcoin is only actually deflationary when it works. It cannot, therefore, be the impracticality of the currency that is really targeted here, but rather its potential malignancy. When deflation is identified as the enemy with which Bitcoin, potentially, collaborates, a new pitch of criticism has been reached. The plausibility of all these arguments is in direct, inverse relation to the development of Bitcoin, as indicated by the rough proxy of its total market capitalization. They rule out a future in which Bitcoin features prominently. It is judged to be mere hype, or a craze. Section 0.862, Antagonism takes Bitcoin seriously. It is not a matter of derision, any longer, but of hostility. Additionally, in crossing this threshold, the hostility previously masked as derision comes out. The inadequacy of contemptuous laughter is recognized. More is required to make Bitcoin stop. It is at this level that the greatest philosophical hunting grounds are opened. With the elevation of ideological intensity comes the lucidity of overt denunciation, an imperative to know one's enemy, and to share what is known. Bitcoin, according to these critics, is a bad thing. Criticism now becomes interesting. Perhaps the predominant future of technically competent left-wing Marxism belongs to this track. Section 0.863, Condescension corresponds to a project of assimilation. It is a concession, even a defeat, subject to a strategy of misdirection. If Bitcoin cannot be ignored, or stopped, perhaps it can be adjusted to convenience. According to this conceptual and rhetorical orientation, Bitcoin is neither a hoax, nor a malignancy. It is merely limited, or immature. It is then to be reconceived as a stepping stone to greater things. Condescension does not originate on the left, but from what might be called, with no small measure of reciprocal condescension, the establishment right. It is essentially conservative and pragmatic, perhaps even opportunistic. Defeat is refashioned into a takeover bid. Condescension is the attitude towards Bitcoin characterizing the mainstream camp, as described in the 4th chapter of this book. Section 0.87, among the controversies intrinsic to Bitcoin, or proper to it, and thus exceeding the schema sketched above, none comes close to matching the importance of the block size debate. In broaching this subject, it is crucial to note, from the beginning, that the nature of Bitcoin necessitates that any debate is essentially peripheralized. Bitcoin has its own proper dispute resolution procedure. It might be more accurately said that the protocol is a dispute resolution procedure, which works through decentralized consensus production and forks, not through dialectic and political reconciliation. Its relation to argument is one of techonomic substitution, rather than politico-philosophical subordination. In this regard, it epitomizes the workaround. Section 0.88, in actuality, Bitcoin falls short of itself. Inevitably, its potential remains only very partially expressed. This is a criticism that only makes sense with reference to a teleological construction. What, in the end, is the purpose of Bitcoin? In selling itself, Bitcoin answers this question in a piecemeal way. It promises and, to some lesser but already non-negligible extent, actually delivers various services, primarily associated with monetary modernization on the cryptic mainstream of the deep industrial process. It defends capital from inflation-oriented political discretion, protects transactional anonymity, ensures contractual execution without reference to financial authorities, and refines currency to facilitate micropayment capabilities. It is, however, far more than any, or all, of this, because decentralization has never been done this well, at least within a social context. Bitcoin is thus nothing less than an escalation of multiplicity. Its potential necessarily escapes any conveniently traced horizon. Section 0.91, the word Bitcoin is itself a terminological wager. It is used in this work in a number of senses, or concentrations. Qualifying these, instance by instance, is impractical. The function it bears most consistently in cryptocurrency's perspective It corresponds to the question what will Bitcoin become, and thus have been. It refers, then, to those current and impending processes distinctively initiated by the 2008 Satoshi Nakamoto paper of that name. Bitcoin names a specific cryptocurrency, but also more loosely and generally any distributed ledger governed by Nakamoto consensus. It thus abbreviates Nakamoto consensus governance. Section 0.92, political terminology is peculiarly resistant to coherent usage, for reasons touched upon in Chapter 4 of this book. In cryptocurrent, liberal is used consistently in its European, rather than its American sense. Philosophical consistency is otherwise impossible. It designates the cause of the autonomous economy, and thus the politics of screening private transactions from public consideration. By celebrated world historic irony, this approach is the opposite of its dominant contemporary, and especially America, sense. Left and right are taken to be defined, respectively, by opposition to, and practical advocacy for, maximally permissive capitalistic activity. Variation on the ideological spectrum, or principal political dimension, PPD, as it is called here, is thus articulated in broadly Marxian fashion, between classical, liberal and socialistic poles. Section 0.93, the attempt has been made to privilege logical over traditional syntax consistently, most pointedly in the placing of quotation marks. While initially set upon the course of a pitiless war of annihilation against semicolons, those wheezing vermin that scratch out a wretched persistence among the unflushed sewers of punctuation, the noble enterprise has allowed itself to be sidetracked on occasions by the depravities of common usage. Section 0.94, compressed date format, #####. Throughout this book is consistently, year, month, day, unless year only, or year, month only. Section 0.95, since it would probably sound absurd to say that Satoshi Nakamoto has triggered the single greatest thing to happen on this planet since the origin of life, we will not say it, unless cryptically.